Only way to start your day.
Global justice. So let's talk about that a little bit today. But before we do, over to you, Aseto, on where you're taking us this week.
Yeah, so today we are in Ivory Coast, a country that is known for its cocoa, the world's largest producer of cocoa, also produces coffee and borders several countries, including Burkina Faso. And as we talk about this country, remember the likes of Yaya Toure, we talk about Didier Drogba and Gavinho in sports, and it is a country that continues to perform well in this field. But today, let's go and talk about the proverb. When the drumbeat changes, the dancers must also adjust their steps. When the drumbeat changes, the dancers must also adjust their steps. How would you interpret that, Doctor?
Well, it means that when things change, you need to change with those things. So, because if you don't, then you may be swept by the change.
Mm-hmm. Hashi?
Well, I think that Ivory Coast should be swept with the change that is happening in Burkina Faso. So I agree with my learned friend on the right. You know, the same people in Ivory Coast are in Burkina Faso. And I think that there should be one huge chocolate factory in the Ivory Coast, because, you know, they produce all this cocoa and they don't have a chocolate factory.
This is true.
It's in Switzerland.
Yes.
This doesn't make sense to my generation, and it will make even less sense to the Gen Zs and the guys who are coming up. So I think that generally that there's a awakening in West Africa and in the Sahel. That part of Africa. And I think that stuff's going to come all the way down to us, which is good, because there's a lot of things that have not been working. You know that the president of Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, wants to get an extra term.
Yes, he does.
Which is unconstitutional. So these are the things we need to sweep into the dustbin of history if we are going to make our societies and states and markets work.
Well, all right. That's a good place to start this morning, even as we get into it. Unga, of course, opened this week. There was a lot of on-the-side conversations before the assembly opened on Monday. And so over the weekend, as world leaders were starting to gather, of course, the chatter on the ground already was that in terms of the composition of the Security Council, there is still the conversation around how more nations of the global south need to be involved or made part of the Security Council, and not just as flower girls, but as actually voting members of the Security Council. Let's start off with there, because the president of Kenya actually said this. He said, you know what, come on, we need to look at how the Security Council is composed. Why do we say we have a United Nations if there are only certain countries who then have veto power when it comes to decisions made around global politics? Let's start with you, Dr. Haneje, and ask the question, where are we with that conversation? What does it kind of look like?
Reforming the United Nations has been on the agenda of many members of the UN for some time now. And I think it edged up a notch higher during the first term of Kofi Annan as Secretary General of the United Nations. But those efforts have not exactly borne fruit. And so we still living in the post-World War II, order, which was or is heavily skewed in favor of the P5, that literally represented the victors of the Second World War. Now today, the international political, geopolitical, and economic architecture has shifted tremendously, including the population ways. But you find that majority of populations in the world are actually not represented. And countries, notably, for instance, Africa, that comprises more than a quarter of the United Nations membership, is not represented. Some countries like India that have become significantly bigger in terms of geopolitics and economics, they're not represented in a way in which perhaps they think is sufficient, or at least speaks to their size, because they don't understand why Britain and France could have a permanent seat, but then they do not, And so it is an idea whose time has come, However, it is something that is going to be very difficult to be able to achieve, right now, considering the geopolitical dynamics. One, while leading members of the United Nations have expressed the desire, for instance, to have Africa represented, there is a challenge there because of the nature of that representation. So many of them will say, yes, we want Africa to be represented, but, well, not with a veto power.
Right.
And yes, we are talking about 1.4 billion people, a continent that is about 30 million square kilometers, which is about 4 times the size of the United States. Without a veto power, it does not exactly make sense. But then at the same time, you have other contestations. For instance, Brazil is key to have a say. Germany would like to have a say, considering the largest economy in Europe. India is keen to have a say, but then Pakistan would be reluctant, to have that happen. Not just Pakistan, but also with the geopolitics of the United Nations, including, competition, for instance, with Beijing, that, may have some reservations about it. And so, while in theory, we seem to see there is a movement towards including, for instance, Africa's agency, the United Nations, the environment geopolitically is just not allowing. And especially right now, where there is absolutely no consensus among the major powers, almost on anything, led by the United States. And that is what has contributed to the dysfunction when it comes to high politics at the United Nations. So much so that part of the potential benefits that Kenya will be getting as a result of perhaps relocation of the United Nations, some agencies to Nairobi, is not so much because Nairobi is, of course, a fairly good place to relocate to, but also because of the funding realities. The U.S. has significantly reduced its funding. The commitments by big powers to fund the United Nations is low, and so even as we talk about expansion, when there's even no money going to the small one that we have right now, how is that going to work? And finally, within the African context itself, we have not reached a consensus on who actually is supposed to sit there. So is it going to be Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, Algeria, or are we going to have some kind of rotating, perhaps, representation?
Depending on the number of positions that if you're even going to be considered for. Just for purposes of, house cleaning, who takes, when you do have a vote of the Security Council, and this is from the permanent veto holding members, what does it take to make a decision? Of the number of people that are there, if I have veto power and I say no, does it hold weight? Does it just need one person to say no for a decision to be swayed in either direction?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Right now, it only takes one. Okay. And so if the rule remains, of course, only going to make things more complicated. Absolutely. Because the more people you have...
Like what we see happening with Israel and the US, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. It only takes one person. Now, unless let's say someone may not support a resolution in principle, but they decide to abstain, then it can proceed. And an example is Uniting for Peace, for Peace, resolution in the 1950s, that allowed the United States and through the United Nations to go to war in Korea. In the absence of that, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to actually reach a consensus. And so that reform also has to include a mechanism with regard to how many. What is the number that is going to be required to proceed with some action? Okay. Because today, you cannot have UN intervention in anything without a consensus, or at least non-veto of all the permanent members.
So let's get a little bit sensitive, Hashi. Look at the permanent members of the Security Council. These are folks that you don't have to question their economic might already. And the folks who essentially formed the big boys club of the United Nations are there. Let's look at the rebuilding of Western Europe after World War II.
Smart girl.
Right? These are the guys who were at the table having the conversation, and they said, well, let's form a club. And so here we are 60 years later, and you're saying, well, we want to be part of the club. And they're telling you, excuse me, we are the ones who built it. Can it work?
I think that's a very pithy way of looking at it, and you're quite right. The United Nations was formed at a place called Yalta, right after the Second World War. And 3 people, 2 big people and a smaller country called Great Britain, which was no longer great. The Soviet Union and the Americans came to dominate international relations. And that structure that was created there, it is the Americans who came with the concept of the United Nations. It is the Americans and the British who came up with the concept of the World Bank, which is called the Bank of Reconstruction and Development. It is
And they sat in Bretton Woods in New Jersey and said, let's do this
the International
thing.
Monetary Fund. These were all institutions that came out of Yalta.
Yeah.
Guess what we were doing? We had sent maybe 500,000 soldiers to Europe, from East Africa and West Africa to Burma to fight in the Second World War. And we had zero part in the creation of these institutions. Why did they create these institutions? The British Sterling area had collapsed. The empire was going. The Americans had become the new overlords of the world, with the Soviet Union taking on Eastern Europe as a buffer so that they don't get invaded again from Germany. And the United Nations then became an institution of an organic institution that mediated the power of Western civilization. What do I mean by that? So you see, today we're seeing the unbridled teeth of power because the conservatives have taken over the American government. Before, the liberals would use the institutions of the United Nations to mediate under the cover of diplomacy, under the cover of trade and globalization, under the cover. This would keep the South mollified, if I can use a proper English word. And in that way, we bought into the system. We bought lock, stock, and barrel. Now, 50 years after the fact, or 70 years after the fact, we are realizing that the United Nations is not an institution that plays by the values and the ideas that we believe should be part of the United Nations. So what do we want in? We want in. We want in the United Nations, and we want it reformed so that it can serve also our interests. But we can't do that from a moral position alone. You can't argue the moral position for inclusivity and say, I want to be part of this thing, without you coming in with bread and butter issues that you also are going to contribute this, and I'm going to contribute that, and I'm going to do this. President Ruto was saying that they got second-hand cars in Haiti.
Yeah.
They didn't get the support that they needed. They need the logistic, blah, blah, blah. It's exactly what I'm talking about. Didn't President Ruto and his foreign minister know that they had a checklist when they were going to Haiti, that this is what we need? We want it on the ground, operating. When we bring our troops in, we want training for at least 90 days or 60 days for us to use that equipment. Mr. Barbecue is somewhere there in Port-au-Prince. We need to know how many forces he has, what is the force intervention he has. These are just basic checklists of intervention. The second thing is that the Kenyan contingent didn't have any even air cover. These Apache. Now, you can't keep going to the Americans or the Europeans and say, we're building world peace. And we're not being provided with the infrastructure for our soldiers to help because we don't have the resources to do that. So this is the crisis of the post-war, 1945 to 1991 is an epoch. 1991 to the first part of the 21st century is an ongoing epoch. 91 is gone after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it is my view that we need to strengthen our own internal mechanisms for doing these things, and in that way have the capacity to come to the table and say, this is what I'm going to contribute to the United Nations, and therefore I have the right to a seat. But South Africa, if I could finish at this point, South Africa is perhaps one of the largest state in Africa. It has submarines. It has
nuclear.
They dismantled their nuclear. Nelson Mandela dismantled their nuclear power. They have the advanced military weaponry. It's not a joke. South Africans are not a joke. So maybe South Africa could be a leader in making sure that African states contribute and African Union troops whose contribution then can be taken to the United Nations, right? With the support of the world. But just sending GISU officers, you saw the other day, there's a GSU person who died, and we don't know if the body has been brought back. The mother was crying on TV. Yeah? Who's going to talk to that woman who's lost her son?
So there is the protection idea that the United Nations has been created such that it only gets to favor some nations or some big boys who play in that league. But then again, Africa, here President William Ruto says, for the United Nations to continue being seen as democratic, changes must happen. Africa needs to have a seat at the table. And when we hear the need to change even the financial structures and how UN works, does Kenya have a case that it is presenting? Dr.
Yeah, most certainly. The global governance system is not exactly democratic. As we've highlighted, it's been skewed, of course, in favor of the global West. And the global West only accounts for the 12% of the world population. So 88% of the world population belongs to the global South. And yet, the ones who are bearing the brunt of the ugly face of modernity and globalization has been the global South, whether it's on climate agenda or even conflict or humanitarian crisis. And so, yes, not just Kenya, but also many other countries, they have a case to make with regard to the need to reform the global governance systems. Now, the challenge, I think, has been for the longest time, the global South has not exactly been fairly organized. And I think that may have inspired the idea behind the formation of the BRICS as a counterweight to a system that was viewed to be skewed in favor of the global West. And today, the combined GDP of the current BRICS is actually larger than the G7, you see. And there are real prospects that BRICS is going to grow and expand. And of course, mostly led by China, which by any standard of measure is going to become the next, big, superpower, perhaps, much greater in terms of economics and technological advancement than even the United States, considering the trend that is happening. And so there is a likelihood that there's going to be a counterweight, to the kind of current order. And perhaps that is what may force the global governance system to see the need to actually change, because power never sits willingly. Power a lot of times has to be taken. True. And unless there's a disincentive or an incentive to do otherwise, the old order, sees no incentive to actually, cede its own privileges. And so it will have to be forced to actually cede those kind of privileges.
Dr. Kaneji, can we really look at that from, I think about it as a band. Every instrument in the band is different in nature. Whether you're talking about drums, winds, all of that, they're different. But there is something that they contribute that helps this concert to be in unison. That's just the way, that the sound that you're trying to create at the end of the day, all of your instruments must be in unison. They must be tuned. They must be creating a sound that makes sense for the director to be able to put everything together. Can we, as the Global South, really, and it's a difficult conversation to have, but it is the reality of the day.
Yes.
Can we as the Global South, and I really don't like that geographical term, but okay, can we as the Global South really make demands on a system that was, number one, created on the tenets of capitalism, created on the system of law and order, of proper leadership and governance to an extent? Can we really demand and say, give us a seat, when we have nations that cannot send their children to school? When we have nations who are not operating in surplus, when we have nations that cannot do anything in terms of, will not do anything in terms of manufacturing and industry, to have them even close to the place whereby we can have this conversation. It's their club, they set the rules. If you want to be part of the club, you play by the rules. Can we really insist on a membership whereby we have not met the requirements for membership?
That's a very, very important question. Unfortunately, there is a principle of sovereign equality of nations in international law. Secondly, there was an argument I was watching recently in the 70s that was being made by the Ian Smith administration, as well as most whites in Rhodesia at the time, that the African is not developed enough and educated enough to be able to make good decisions, and therefore they should not be allowed to vote or even become independent. Now, one, if we have not made the requirements, who wrote those requirements?
And why can't we write our own?
Exactly.
This has been my permanent question.
That is what we're exactly trying to do, because we didn't write those requirements. It's almost like, well, someone sets a standard, which sometimes is even impossible for you to meet. And yet, let's be honest, when at the founding of the United Nations, for instance, Britain was in ashes. Most of Europe had been destroyed. See, Truman had to create this concept of third world to actually separate America from the rest. It was a political creation, you see. It does not mean that these economies were super advanced. No, they were literally in trash. You know, today Kenya is far ahead of many countries that at the time were actually in Europe in terms of the GDP and in terms of just certain infrastructure prospects. And so, to the extent that these guys keep demanding A, B, C, and D, it is also disingenuous, you know. One, there are many countries, for instance, not all countries that became members of the United Nations were democratic.
Sure.
You know, many countries, even in Asia, even like South Korea, many of them were under the military until barely 30 years ago, you see. And so, who sets the rules? Even when we talk about the rule of law who sets a rule-based international system? Whose rules are we talking about? You know, this does not mean that we want a state of nature where, you know, we're going to kill each other and might is right, you know. But do we have agency in those rules? You had one of the senators in the U.S. after Netanyahu was indicted by International Criminal Court. He said, well, the ICC was formed for Africa and, you know, some other parts of the world, not for us.
Of course.
So are those the rules-based order that we're talking about? So that is what we are challenging. We're saying, no, we have agency, we're going to be on the table. So whether there's one Kenyan scholar who always try to quote because it inspired a lot of my thinking about the world, called Ali Mazrui.
Yes.
And at some point he said, you can live in dignity without living in luxury. We don't have to be driving Rolls Royces to meet the standard. But we actually, as citizens and as human beings, we have a right to certain inalienable rights to be able to enjoy them. And for representation, because if we're going to be part of something, then for sure we should have a say. How we're going to figure out things in our own backyard is another question. Yes, we need to be held to a higher standard, but we also have to have a say in that standard in terms of setting it.
Just a quick rejoinder. Yes. I think that there's such a thing as universalism.
Yes.
And there's such a thing as partisan universalism. That the universalism is there for us to see. Yeah, that these institutions are there, and we're part of the global system, and we're nation states, and we're sovereign, and yes. But I think that abdicates a responsibility that we have for us to go there uprightly. The Sahel Union yesterday got out of the ICC. They withdrew because the institution was unfair. The one of the United Nations is unfair. The question that is in Africa today is whether we should withdraw or we should reform. That's the question Nigerians ever saying, that there's a truth. Then there's another, it's in Chimamanda's, this young lady, one of the really amazing writers writing today about Africa. So there's an invisible truth leaning on the truth itself. You can't see it, but there's a truth leaning on that truth, an invisible truth. So my point is that I firmly believe in, and I support what my colleague has said about us going there to reform these institutions so that they reflect our own contributions there. But my view also is that we have to have a partisan universalism. If we can't claim human rights and that we are humans, but we have to contribute something to this human rights and this humanism. We have to come with something there. That means that we have to fix our markets. We have to fix our states. We have to fix our union in the regions. We have to make sure that there's a double road from Nigeria from Lagos to Nairobi. I can drive to Ibadan from here, go through Chad, and without any I shouldn't have any problems doing that. Now, once we're focused on that kind of partisan universalism, then our foreign affairs will make a lot of sense. Sorry, you were about to ask something.
No, I was just looking at some facts here, and why does this matter? Why does this conversation even matter in the first place? Why fight when you're not even part of the organization itself from its inception? You are coming in, playing second fiddle, and it's been an ongoing fight. And I'm looking at, so the UN has 15 members. So the 5 permanent members is the US, the UK, France, Russia, China. Then you have 10 non-permanent members elected after every 2 year times, but they have no veto power in any case. So Africa has no permanent representation, yet it makes up to 54 member states, which is 28% of the entire constitution of the UN. So when I look at this, so we're looking at these 5 and their reluctance to dilute their veto powers essentially, and it's very clear why. And I'm looking at some statistics here, looking at numbers in terms of our contribution. So you're looking at contributions. The UN does not get the money through taxes. It's contributions from member states. So I'm looking at the numbers, and you know, there's the equation of money, power, respect. So if we look at how then the UN is funded, the top contributors, the US is 22%. One country. Of regular budget. And when you talk about peacekeeping, that's 27% of the entire budget of the UN. China is 15%. Germany 6%. UK and France 4 to 5% each. There's Japan, which is 8%. Now, together, these few countries are taking more than half of the UN's regular budget. Now, in comes Africa. Let's look at Africa's contribution. So 54 countries contribute a very small percentage of the UN's budget, because most of the African countries are obviously fall into the lower income categories. But let's look at the 3, because as you talked about South Africa, because of its military power compared to the rest of the other African nations. So you've got Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, which contribute more than the other African countries. Kenya, I was looking at the numbers, and I stand to be corrected, is 0.1% of the UN regular budget. How does Kenya get around a table with 0.1%
and make demands
that we want to also have veto power, we want permanent seat around this table? Does it even make sense? Why are we having this conversation in the first place?
That is a very legitimate question. Now, one of the things I've always, argued about, and especially with following the reform of the Organization of African Unity to African Union, the Constitutive Act, and the kind of sentiments expressed about African Renaissance, African solutions to African problems. I always say African solutions to African problems is only possible with African money, because that is what we leave out. You cannot get respected when you bring nothing on the table. 2, you can never set your agenda if whoever is paying for that agenda is somebody else. That person is actually going to set the agenda. The AU budget is about $600 million. IGAD is about $1 million. 80-90% of those budgets are actually funded almost
externally.
exclusively.
China and the European.
These are our union.
So that's our own.
Even the building was constructed by China.
Of course, we live in a donated, building. Kenya's budget, this past year was $34 billion. Okay, which is a tiny fraction of actually the African Union budget. That is probably even less than budget of one ministry in Kenya. So someone cannot tell me that the continent cannot be able to raise $1 billion. We can actually do that in our sleep. Kenya alone can be able, can pay for it. The finance bill alone could actually pay for several years of the UN budget. When you look at the money was supposed to actually to be saved, or at least, rather to be raised. So yes, we can. So even as we demand the reform, we also have to raise our own expectations. What is going to be our role in it? What contributions are we going to make as a result? However, at the same time, it does not mean that because we're contributing very little, we also have no say. And here's the thing. We also happen to be a continent that produces almost most of the world's minerals, that the world needs and uses. And as a result, we suffer the most consequences.
But we suffer because we've allowed the foreigners to come in, control the same minerals.
Yes, we have allowed, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Remember, let's talk about the phenomenon in West Africa, for instance. These countries, after independence, they were never really independent, and especially the Francophone, countries. They literally remain vessels of Paris, of the French. Their system, even previously, if we wanted to make a call, it had to go through, maybe France before it actually came back to Senegal, and yet you're calling from Togo. You understand? It was... I just came from Senegal, they still use the franc, system. And which literally, a lot of it is determined by also what is happening in France. And so you still have this very extensive colonial
vestiges.
And architecture, but this architecture is also now tied to the international financial system. If you just abandon it overnight, guess what is going to happen? Your dollar is going to look like that in Zimbabwe, you see. Why? Because also the financial system, we don't exactly control it, and so even though those who've been very audacious in trying to get out of it, they found it extremely challenging. That you actually need a lot more collaborative and organized approach as opposed to trying to go it alone. And so, yes, we need. For us to increase our agency, we need to increase our contributions. We also need to actually start increase our contributions to our regional economic communities.
Don't we need to go even beyond that and say that we actually need to get our houses in order?
We need to
in
get
the
our
first
houses
place,
in
because
order.
here we are having a conversation and saying, well, we again going back to the club scenario. You want to be part of a club for which you don't meet the rules.
Okay,
and here we are also saying that in the way in which it started in the first place, that and we are saying, is this about money? Yes, it is. It's really 90% vested in capitalism.
Yes.
It's the folks who were able to make money and rebuild a part of the world who came together and said, you know what, let's be able to do this no matter what. I'm simplifying it, but that's essentially what it was.
Can I try and answer that?
The United...
I don't think
let me ask the question, Hashi. So that the world came together and said, we've built a part of Western Europe, we've put back together the Great Britain and Germany, so how about we do this for the rest of the world all the time?
Okay.
That's essentially what they did.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The Marshall Plan, America was the only guy standing after the Second World War. The Russians rejected the Marshall Plan. You cannot have capital in one country and not have other countries to trade with. So the United States was acting in its own interest for the Marshall Plan.
As it always does.
So they went to the Europeans and they said, we're going to prop you guys up because they want to trade with them. They actually sent donkeys to England. Donkeys. And the donkeys didn't do so well in England because they were from Alabama. They sent machinery, they sent pipes, they sent everything that was needed to reconstruct Europe. Everything. And they gave them money on top of that. And in that way, the United States could start trading with Europe again. Which is in the interest of the American economy. My view is that we should withdraw from the United Nations.
Me too.
My view is that we should withdraw from these IMF and World Bank institutions. Because they are exploitative in nature to our economies and to our societies. I don't understand why. And we have to have a conversation with the Kenyans and the region and Africa and the world in a way that the conversation has some kind of meaning to them. I'll give you a specific example of what I mean. All the delegations from Africa who went there were staying in 7-star hotels.
This is it.
If you look at the money our delegation would have spent in New York, you'd be shocked. The French Prime Minister was hanging out in a 2-3 bedroom place in town, and he was walking. In fact, you saw that, right? The police officers blocked him because Trump was passing. they carpooled to go to the UN. The Europeans. Belgium has a bigger economy than most of the African countries in this region. So it is the priorities of the African political elite that is at the table here.
Sorry, if I may, Dr. Khaneje, because we will talk about resources from the African continent. It is not a matter that we don't have enough. It is the prioritization of how these resources are going to be used that usually is our issue. And I think of DR Congo in the times of Patrice Lumumba, and it was an engineering by the CIA to come and hold a leader hostage so that they could control the resources. But my question is this: why are we not able, because you can't tell me we don't want to, why are we not able for year on year to be able to stand up and say, this is how this thing should be? You can't tell me otherwise. Ghana the other day said, okay, fine, no more cocoa to the rest of the world. That's great. But do you have a factory in Ghana that's going to be able to process the thing? You don't. If the DR Congo today was to stand up and say, actually, we're not going to allow the extraction of resources anymore, are you able to do it inside? You tell me when African nations went to Texas and said, we want a buy-in here in your oil rigs, or went to California and said, we also want a buy-in here for your gold. Has it ever happened? It has never happened. Why are we the ones who are not able to stand up? If we can't stand up, how do we then go and say we want to then be able to control this big boy club of yours when you decide who switches the lights on and off in the world? How?
You know, we understand part of the challenge of the African story of African saga has been the problem of state formation itself. You know, we've spent a lot more time trying to fix our own states and make them into viable nation states. And it was only until after 1990 that many states started actually negotiating that statehood. And they were, plunged into a series of endless conflicts and stuff like that. And you realize most African leadership, they're a lot more focused on domestic, audience, as opposed to actually, trying to advance the national interest of their own countries. Now, that aside, I still will be reluctant to today, pull out of the United Nations without an alternative system of governance. I think the continent should strive to see how best they can be able to go. As I did mention, the establishment of the BRICS, for instance, is an attempt to establish that alternative to the existing order that is perceived not to be working. It is easy to quit, but what is the alternative? Realistically speaking, we also the continent. Unfortunately, while we contribute the least, we actually benefit the most from the United Nations in terms of programming, whether it's UNICEF, UNHCR, and stuff like that. We have most of those problems around here. Even the efforts on climate change, even though they've been vetoed a lot more by the developed countries. And so, to the extent that we're profiting from some of these things, what can we be able to do in terms of also pulling up our socks to ensure that we actually have a say and agency within the global governance institutions? Of course, we know Bretton Woods institutions have been giving us a short end of the stick. However, I think we need to be able to fight, but we need to be smart about it, not emotional about it, not reactive about it, but strategic about it in exploiting these global governance institutions.
I think, can I just rejoin you? I think that, nothing has been done without theory. And my contention is that once we continue on this vicious cycle, and there's no break with it, it's not possible for us to imagine an alternative. Our alternative is something called the African Union. That's our alternative. The political class that we have in this country and in the rest of Africa are obsessed with something called the nation state. Well, the rest of the world is breaking it down. Well, that's just the fact, political economic fact. And it is because of the myopia of our political class that this is happening to us. So I think that we should strengthen the institutions of the African Union and give our part of our sovereignty, part of it, not all of it, until at such a time the trust has been created for there to be an institutional capacity. The second thing is that we cannot do all these things without an economy.
No.
We cannot do this without an economy. So we just had a cup of coffee here right now. That cup of coffee costs about $5 in the US. It's the coffee's from here in Nairobi. It's been paid, 5 cents has been paid to the farmer. Why? Why? Now, I think that we have to ask ourselves fundamental questions, because some part of the Generation Z that wants to overturn the government are asking these questions themselves. Yes. This is part of the social debate in this country. I'm not telling you anything radical in this news desk. It has been happening in this country. It's been happening in every other country in Africa, from Tunisia all the way down to Angola, to Mozambique, to Zimbabwe. The whole group of generation of people, and Africans in general, are now allying themselves to say we are going to put an end to exploitation. And how to put an end to this exploitation, my learned friend is correct. We have to provide an alternative. And if we don't make that African Union work, I think we're in deep trouble.
But Hashi, how do you talk about an African Union that needs to work at a point when the budget that funds that African Union as well comes from the Brenton institutions? You know, it is a question of agenda for the African Union will always be set by those who fund it. So in terms of African leaders sitting together and first of all agreeing to work together and allowing themselves to contribute to African Union and giving African Union the funding that they need to operate is a subject matter that needs to be addressed.
There's a philosopher from Ghana teaching here in Tanzania. It's called Aikwe Arma. I remember he wrote that book, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born.
Yes.
So I think the beautiful ones have been born. It's the Gen Z. Our children, my children, they're Gen Zs. I think they have been born, and they are the most militant social formation in African history. I think they're much more militant than even the independence era people, and they're overthrowing governments in the continent, in the Sahel. Probably going to be another coup in Nigeria, probably. I think there's going to, if these people do not pay attention to the political economy of the state of these young people in this continent, there will be military coups and dictatorships that are leftists that want to do this developmental work. Because there's no alternative that has been given to these people. I'll give you an example. France has gone to the debt market. It was crying about paying their workers.
Yeah.
Do you know that? Do you know why that's a crisis? Because the people in the Sahel Union cut the pipes.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's it. And you know, they've been calling Wallace and Ouattara to come to France to go and try and convince the people in the Sahel to stop this. Guess what they did? They also removed themselves from the ICC. So these things I'm talking about are not things that are theoretical. It is happening in the continent. The African Union. The African Union is refusing to recognize the Sahel Union. When 99.99%, if not 100% of all Africans recognize the Sahel Union as the leading state political actor in our continent today.
So is our problem our leadership?
No, our problem is we're not decisive. We have to be decisive to make things work. What answer do we have to this lady here in the newspapers today, which is seeking clarity for the officer's death in Haiti? Broke my heart to see that family last night on television. It broke my heart. Because the president has not given this family an answer as to why their son was taken half down to the bottom of the earth to go and help Africans. They want to help Africans because Haiti, you know, is the country that built the French economy. It is under Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines. Half of the money or the resources of the Haitian Republic is the one that funded the Napoleonic Wars. I'm not talking about theory, I'm talking about facts. The United States invaded Haiti and plundered their central bank and took all the gold out and sent it to New York. Fact. Fact check these things. We have to put an end to this miserable nonsense so that we can start cooperating in our region so that we don't make a Rolls Royce of Ali Mazrui, but we can make a real nice Kwanzaa car. or, an M-Pesa car if you want.
The Sahel.
A Kwanzaa car. But you just saw that I could go buy a car for $1,000 here, just like the South Koreans did it.
Yeah.
We want to be rich. We want to be prosperous. We want to live well. Because the country that we have and the region we have in the continent is rich.
Yes.
Why is it that we as Africans who are on top, Kwame Nkrumah, the great Kwame Nkrumah said, it is not Africa that is poor, it's Africans who are poor. It's not the continent.
Well, Dr. Kanenje, there was a gentleman, a leader in this continent, Muammar Gaddafi, and although his style was often very dramatic, he was very, very clear on his core message. Africa is sidelined, obviously, in the global governance, and he was pushing for United States of Africa. And I'm just looking at some of the things that he said at the time, because it was very, very outspoken. And in 2009, in the UN General Assembly, he called the UN Security Council a terror council that is run by the P5. He called them out and told them, you are actually terrorists, and tore up a copy of the UN Charter in protest. Is it time then, like Kash is saying, we just say, come on, let's forget this business of trying to fight for space in the UN.
Appeasing them.
Let's roll back our sleeves, come back to the continent, because it almost appears our African leaders are using the UN and this excuse of trying to get a position in the UN as a crutch. But there are issues back at home that they don't want to sort.
It is true. I watched that speech by Gaddafi live. Okay. Yes. Yeah. And Gaddafi had he moved from Pan-Arabism to Pan-Africanism. And he had become probably the most outspoken Pan-Africanist at the time, in word and in deed. He actually followed through a lot. And one of the things I always share with our Western friends, whether diplomats or otherwise or scholars, is the overthrow of Gaddafi planted the seeds of a lot of issues we have on the continent today, including anti-Western sentiment, because the insecurity that it unleashed in the entire West Africa and the Sahel region contributed directly to actually the kind of environment we see today in West Africa, and increasingly the kind of instability we have seen across the continent. Yes, he had gotten tired of the United Nations being a talking club, and especially where the matters of war and peace were concerned. Remember, that is one area where actually the UN has done horribly, you see. When it came to other matters, they have tried to make progress, whether it's, children to do with, habitat and stuff like that. This progress has been made. Money is still not enough, but progress has been made. There are lots of other UN instruments that have actually worked. But when it comes to the area of high politics, is an area that it has failed. And nothing can be a bigger testament that today what we are witnessing, a genocide, for instance, in Gaza, and then the United Nations is unable to do anything.
Unable to call it a genocide.
Exactly. We're witnessing the worst humanitarian crisis in Sudan. Okay, the United Nations is unable to do anything.
Yep.
You see, Congo is still on the precipice.
Yep.
If someone tells you things have been settled, they are lying to you. The United Nations still unable to do anything. The UN is also unable to act and to be able to bring parties in Ukraine and Russia together. You see, these are the failures, but these are now the failures when it comes to the high politics. And this is what he was talking about. When it comes to high politics, the UN has actually failed miserably. There are very few areas that were less contestable areas where the UN may have succeeded, but those were not controversial. But when it really mattered, the United Nations has actually, failed. However, at the same time, it is one thing to wish something were different, is another thing to do something that is different. And the thing will be one, because even within the UN and African Union, we have the principle of subsidiarity, meaning it is important to strengthen regional mechanisms that can be robust enough to take care of your own problems with the blessings of the United Nations, you see, than relying on the United Nations for everything, because sometimes we blame them for things we can actually be able to do.
Yep.
I just gave an example in terms of even the budget. IGAD, $200 million. You actually can Do you want to tell me we cannot raise $200 million in IBED?
Yes,
to be able
we
to do
can.
things? Of course we can. But why are we not doing that? Let's come back to the East African community. You know there are members who have not paid?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is what I'm talking about, though.
And I see their citizens drive very fancy cars in Nairobi the last time I checked.
Yeah.
Like just 3 of those cars can actually pay their dues.
There you go.
You understand? And we can't even do that.
South Sudan.
You said it. I didn't say that, so don't. And so the truth is we've also been extremely lazy. We like to complain a lot, but while we're demanding agency and representation, we are very slow to act. We have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, what exactly can we be able to do? Because we can.
So why don't? Because we give the example of Gaddafi and Libya. I just want to look at Libya for a moment, because we always then use case study and case example. Before what I will call overtly the overthrow of Gaddafi, that there were no development programs in Libya. There was no external aid in Libya. That the economy of Libya compared to any European country. And this was because Gaddafi decided that he was going to put in social programs that would help the people of Libya first. They're crude, sought after by most of the nations of the world because of its easiness for refinery, then was sold to nations for profit. And he empowered the people of the country. Now, think about it. He was called a strong man. When he died, or when they killed him, Libya now is dependent on aid to send children to school. Libya now is being supported by developmental powers because they've then been able to come in and introduce some element of control of the resource. My point is that even this club that we are trying to get into, they are not doing it because they want the world to come together and have a kumbaya moment and let's all love each other. That's not the case. It's for selfish interests.
Okay. The narrative is good. It's right. It's righteous. And do you know that the president of Uganda, according to WikiLeaks, was involved in betraying Muammar Gaddafi? It's not something I'm alleging. It's in WikiLeaks, and anybody can look it up. When he met Jendaya Fraser, I think it was Jendaya Fraser in Kampala, and it is Muammar Gaddafi who helped Yoweri Museveni liberate Uganda. Without his financial resources and equipment and military equipment, they would not have been able to get into power. So the question is pointing to the political class in our societies.
Absolutely.
Are they genuinely national? Are they ready for integration? Are they ready to support each other so that their citizens can get proper healthcare, proper education, and proper schooling? I think that we have to force that issue down their throats. We don't have to ask them anymore. I'll give you an example. We're dealing with SHA, right? We have a SHA problem.
Well, you could say that.
Is that right? But why is SHA a controversy? Because people have decided that healthcare is a right.
Yes.
And that the government must provide healthcare. Correct? That's a popular, grassroots pressure on the government. And they are not sleeping at night because the people have said, we want this because it's our right. They want capitation, more money to be sent to schools. The Minister of Education is not sleeping because there's popular sentiment on the ground. They tried to bring a tax law to try and tax people more. The mace at the National Assembly was taken to pipeline, and the horses too. There was horses in the apartment. So it's a fact. It's a newspaper. You can just Google that right now and you'll see it. So I'm not theorizing anything. I don't like to theorize things because then you can be accused of opinion, having an opinion, which is a very dangerous thing nowadays to have one. Now I want to put it to you that it is freedom. Amartya Sen. You know, we want freedom. We want to be able to, every citizen to be able to access healthcare, to get an African Union, to fly to Ethiopia for $100 and not for $800. To fly to South Africa for maybe $500 and not $2,000. We want to be able to get this iPhone to give the people of the DRC, right, development, because this comes from them.
Yes.
If they stop mining that, there'll be no phones. Why are we accepting this kind of exploitation? That is the question that the Gen Zs are posing. That is why I'm trying to run. That's why I'm going to run for the seat here in my constituency, Langata, so I can go to the National Assembly and raise these questions with the executive, with the speaker, with the people, and say, no, no, no. We are not going to allow for there to be food aid in Kenya when we want to give the UAE, Galana, to go and feed the Middle East. So I think that this is not rocket science, what we're thinking about. Any high school student in this country
Figure it out.
can figure this out, as my learned friend there, Oki, tells us. So you're absolutely right, and I think that the dynamics of this continent are fundamentally changing, and it couldn't be brought faster enough.
Yeah.
Dr. Kaneja?
Yes. I think one thing has been clear. One of the things that has always been missing, I don't know if you've ever watched African representation outside the continent. One, we tend to send sometimes, unfortunately, our most mediocre people.
There you go.
Okay? Let's be honest, whether diplomats or anything. Two, we tend to be so muted, even some of the presidents of some of the countries on the continent who could be perhaps strong men or strong women. Once they are in New York, they are so muted like chicken.
True.
They cannot even express a sentiment. Our representatives, a lot of times, they're busy doing shopping and going to strip clubs.
Yes.
Let's be honest. You understand? And so things are being discussed, agendas are being discussed, and guess what? No one is paying attention. It was embarrassing one time in this country, and the president of the country at the time was meeting White House officials and with a delegation. And unfortunately, the president was the only one taking notes.
Shocking.
Yeah, when the rest of the people were simply watching. And so we actually have that problem when it comes to international audience. You see, we don't raise our voice in a way that is constructive. We go with too many things because we're not focused. We suck up to literally kind of things we could not actually do back home.
And sleep at the world of Astoria.
Yes, and somehow we get shocked by foreign audiences and foreign environment. It's just, an honest, truth. And so once we can be able to put our house in order, organize ourselves, and have a sense of self-respect and dignity, then a lot of people are actually going to take us seriously. But how do you expect to be taken seriously when you're not taking yourself seriously?
There it is. And that's the question for us to unfortunately end this conversation on this morning. There's a lot. There's a lot to be considered. There's a lot to be said. But then there's a lot more to actually be done. We've courted the issue for too long. It's about time to take the girl home, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Hassan Kaneja and Ahmed Hashi have joined us this morning. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation today and keeping it fresh in our minds of how we should be thinking, how we should be acting, and how we should be doing. Good morning. 10 minutes past 8.
Best show in the country.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.